to Dan Blumstein from UCLA, professor there, co-director of the Evolutionary Medicine program at UCLA, and also a member of our organizing committee for Club EvMed. And Dan's going to introduce our speakers, our panelists today, and he'll organize the conversation. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Meredith, and thanks everybody for joining. It's my pleasure to introduce Joe Alcock, who's an ER doctor and professor at the University of New Mexico Department of Emergency Medicine, where he teaches evolutionary medicine to medical students. He's author of the Evolution Medicine blog, and he studies, among other things, evolutionary principles that may enhance our ability to use the human gut microbiome to treat acute and chronic diseases. Martie Haselton is the senior author on this paper, is a professor in the departments of psychology, departments of communication studies, and the Institute of Society and Genetics at UCLA. She's a leader in how evolution has shaped the social mind, and author of the book Hormonal, The Hidden Intelligence of Hormones, How They Drive Desire, Shape Relationships, Influence Our Choices, and Make Us Wiser. And Barb Horowitz is a physician and professor at both UCLA and Harvard, where she teaches courses on evolutionary medicine. She's author of the New York Times bestselling book Zubiquity, and another one, Wildhood, and she is currently president of the International Society of Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health. So thank you for joining us here today. In late 2020, while everyone was pretty much locked in and we were in the midst of our pre-vaccine pandemic, you authors and a number of other equally distinguished and wonderfully intellectually diverse co-authors published a perspective in PNAS, The Pandemic Exposes Human Nature, 10 Evolutionary Insights. I found the paper really stimulating when it came out. I found it chock full of hypotheses worthy of testing. I find it's sort of what I really look for in thought-leading evolutionary medicine type papers. Would you guys like to introduce the paper briefly?
Sure, I can say a few words about it. This is sort of a beautiful Frankenstein of a paper, collecting all of these perspectives from authors from such diverse backgrounds. And we didn't know, so Ben Seitz is the graduate student who is the first author on the paper. And I was at the time teaching a research methods class to undergraduates, and I kept telling them, you know, this is a really important social science moment. I said, a lot of our human nature is being exposed by this because we are being challenged in these really interesting ways. So we're finding out, you know, just where the pressure points are, what are the things that we absolutely need, you know, people, and what are the things that perhaps we don't need. And I thought that principle should apply to the academic work that we are doing as well. And so we crafted an idea, and then we circulated we went to our co-authors, a very diverse group of co-authors, and asked them to participate. And people were quite willing to participate and had a variety of different insights. And so the paper covers all the way from thinking about, which Joe will speak about, thinking about how the virus might affect us socially, to what lockdown, this is something that Barb might want to speak about, what lockdown has done in terms of minimizing our exposure to things that we actually might want to be exposed to, a variety of insights about possible changes in gender norms, changes in unemployment rate that will be differential between men and women. That's something that we speculated about, and that has definitely come true. And we also forecast a decline in the birth rate, which seems like sort of a no-brainer. You look back at previous pandemics and you see similar patterns, but it's really been quite dramatic. So in California, for example, our population has decreased by the size of 2 Santa Barbaras. So that's because of the decline in the birth rate and some other things as well. But I think that we are just beginning to see how the pandemic is going to affect us socially and what parts of our human nature are exposed by this. Would my co-authors like to add anything along those lines, Joe?
I'll jump in, sure. And thank you, Martie. And thanks, Charlie and Meredith. And I want to also thank Ben Seitz for doing the heavy lifting on this paper, and also inviting me and the other co-authors to take part in this. It's been a really great experience, and I'll speak to my part in the paper, which wouldn't have happened without Athena Actipis. Athena was unable to join this call today. At least that's what, as of earlier this morning. She may join later. But Athena Actipis and her COVID-19 project with a whole variety of collaborators who've been kicking around different ideas from the very beginning of this pandemic, and thinking about ways in which we might expect evolutionary medicine principles and evolutionary psychology principles to affect how this virus interacts with us. And one of the things that we were interested in, and I'm hoping to get feedback from you, I see a lot of great faces in the audience, is this idea that the virus may affect our social behavior. It would benefit the virus and viral fitness to increase opportunities for transmission of the virus. And so we speculated that the virus might influence human behavior and manipulate our behavior in ways that increase opportunities for transmission, and in particular increase social interactions in between humans and infected humans. So that's one idea that we have, and there's good reasons, and there are many examples in biology of viruses and other pathogens manipulating behavior. Toxoplasmosis, Toxoplasma gondii is the canonical example of that. But there are plenty of examples of bacteria and viruses doing similar things. I was reading yesterday that Mycobacterium tuberculosis has a protein that induces a cough. So that's a nice manipulation for a respiratory pathogen. There's no such evidence of that in coronaviruses, but coronaviruses are, from what we gather, they have a whole variety of non-structural proteins, and a big chunk of their genome is dedicated to evading immune responses. And one that has gotten a lot of attention is evasion of interferon. And interferon is responsible for sickness behavior. So one of the, if we, as I and many do, think that sickness behavior is a adaptation on the part of hosts that marshals immune responses and may actually prevent transmission of disease, then the virus has an interest in inhibiting sickness behavior. So that's one thing that we're interested in, is this idea that the virus may make us unsick. And one feature of SARS-CoV-2 is that asymptomatic spread is a major factor, both in the super spreading events and also in what we're seeing with some of these. So the virus has an interest both in making us asymptomatic and making us appear unsick, but may also affect mood and make us more apt to engage in social behaviors than we otherwise might be. So that's the proposal.
So if I could sort of throw out a question and sort of have you guys riff off this, some of these links, particularly about how pathogens influence host behavior, I think are clear, to be expected. You frame nicely where to look for these sorts of effects. Some of these are ecological and evolutionary principles, but they're culturally quite plastic. How do you, and wisely, I think what you did throughout the paper was each of the sections ended with, here's what you need to look for. Here's what could be research we could be do going forward to see if here are some predictions we're sort of expecting. But how do you sort of, trade off the sort of more concrete things with the culturally more plastic possibilities? Marty, Barb?
Are you talking about gender norms?
Yeah.
Yeah, I figured. So I think that there are definitely, I think there's a fundamental biological reason that women would more often than men choose to leave their jobs, and that is that every one of their offspring is one of their precious few. And so I think that over evolutionary time, women's psychology has been shaped to trade off own well-being for offspring's well-being, more so, I think, for women than for men. Of course, there are also social norms that and also some sort of structural factors. So the social norm is that the expectation is that women will do this more often than men. And then structurally, if women make less money than men, then they're more likely to be the ones within a heterosexual couple where the woman would leave her job. So I think there are a variety of things that are all conspiring to create a situation where women have left the workforce much more often than men. I read a statistic this morning that if you look at non-farm payroll losses, basically it's all women. That accounts for all of the losses in jobs, losses of employment. I think that there could be a sort of self-perpetuating cycle here, such that when women leave their jobs and they go back into the home and perhaps have a partner, it's a very gender traditional sort of arrangement. Once that starts to happen, I think people then go and reinforce those norms, in part because there's not much of a choice. If you leave the workforce as a woman, then you are dependent on your partner, or dependent on others. And so traditional arrangements might sound like they are okay, men as breadwinners and women as homekeepers. And so I worry a little bit that this will be self-perpetuating in this way, but so it's both, Dan. I mean, I think there's some fundamental biological foundations here psychologically, but then I think that there are, of course, social forces that are at play.
I think you wisely realize that human behavior really is at the crux of how we interact with COVID, and our ultimate successes are not as much based on the amazing biomedical breakthroughs that have come, but the sort of burden, if you will, of dealing with human behavior. How do we take these cognitive adaptations and use them as a force for good? What are the sort of actionable ideas that have emerged from this that you think can be leveraged in ways to help us continue to fight COVID?
We need childcare.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line. I mean, I think it's never been clearer that this is a major structural problem. And I don't know, I'm not a policymaker, but I hope that has become so clear that perhaps there will be some changes that will level the playing field more for men and women. Now, that's my particular area. The paper, of course, covers much more than that, so I should let others chime in. Are there other questions?
You want to open it up for questions for the audience? Joe Graves has some questions. Joe, would you like to ask your questions?
Absolutely. I got to tell you, I thought the piece, offered some interesting perspectives, and none of them were actually surprising in any way, because these are sort of old tropes in the just so arsenal of human behavior. But one of the things that I found most disturbing was the complete absence of any attention towards racially structured health disparity, especially given the fact that early on in the pandemic, actually I wrote a piece before we had data. One of the most apparent health disparities was between Black and brown people who live under the conditions that would promote viral transmission, and who don't have an option about staying home with regard to their jobs, as many Hispanic workers did in the Midwest, who had to go to work because if they don't go to work, they don't get a paycheck. I also was really disturbed by the absence of any non-white folks on the author line. Obviously, there was some thought as to pulling together the experts to write that paper. And again, the absence of a discussion of race and racism in relation to health disparity and COVID, I think, is reflected by the fact that you didn't ask anybody who wasn't white to be on the author line.
That's not true. That's actually not true. We did.
So
we did. Not everybody we invited was able to participate. We really did.
Well, I'm going to say one more thing about that. Given that I know a lot of the people on the author line, I'm just wondering why you didn't ask me.
I wish we had. We really did see this as a whole, that we were, Ben and I were quite concerned, Ben, the first author, and I were quite concerned that we were missing this big piece, because clearly this is a big part of what has unfolded during the pandemic. Even with respect to the gender roles issues that I've talked about, women of color have left their jobs much more often than white women. So so they've been affected more. Absolutely. And would we have liked to have had a more thorough treatment of that issue? Absolutely, we did want to have that, and we almost held the paper back, but we felt that it was too important to get it done and out. So with all due respect, I understand the critique, and we actually were quite concerned about that. But the paper was produced at such a pace that that we weren't able to cover everything that we wanted to.
Kyla Kaufman has a question. Kyla, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. So I was just wondering, like along the lines of Joe's questions, if you could reflect on how you would update the paper if you published it today instead of June 2020, which is before a lot of developments have happened, in the past year.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And just getting back to Joe's point, I just want to underscore that I agree. It would have been great to have him as part of this paper, and I'll just leave it at that. So with regard to the question, how would we update this? There have been a few interesting developments along sort of molecular biology of SARS-CoV-2. One of the most interesting is that it appears that there is a protein encoded by the SARS-CoV-2 genome that inhibits pain signaling. It inhibits, it affects the neuropilin receptor and affects something called VEGF pain signaling, so involved in neuropathic pain. Again, this is maybe out on the edge of speculation, but the authors of this paper, the main author of that paper, last name is Motal, he has said that this actually may be a host manipulation on the part of the virus. Inhibition of pain may assist in immune evasion, but it also affects behavior. Pain is a major motivator of physical activity and whether or not we leave the house. So to the extent that an early infection may actually inhibit pain, that might impact how social behavior. So that's another mechanism. I've been paying close attention to the various mechanisms by which SARS-CoV-2 might affect human behavior in ways that enhance its fitness. So that's one example. There are others, but I'm fascinated with this idea that it may actually inhibit pain. And in fact, on the flip side of that, there's a recent paper showing that people that experience a greater degree of pain actually have better outcomes with SARS-CoV-2. These are things that we wouldn't expect a priori, and it illustrates that there could be a tug of war involving both interferon, social behavior, sickness behavior, and pain.
A couple people have hands up, and feel free to put your hand up. How about Molly, Ron, and then Eric? Molly Fox, you have a question.
Sure. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to, this interesting possibility of altering host social behavior, just especially because of the recency of the zoonotic transmission from, the leap from bats to humans, where from reading the EvMed journal, I have come to learn a lot about the different interferon systems in the two hosts. From Bernard Crespi's interesting paper on this topic and talk. And so I was just wondering, is there some idea about how selection, is this a very recent selection, or is this kind of more of an epiphenomenon, or that there could be the kind of suppression of sickness behavior that if we're seeing that in humans, is that something that is relevant to the original bat hosts?
Yeah, those are also excellent questions. And if others have more expertise in that area, I would welcome that. I will say that some of these seem to be general features of coronaviruses, which affect multiple species. So we see similar interferon interference in the original SARS virus, as well as a variety of other coronaviruses. So it may be a general feature of that this category of viruses. And it might be that we're paying such close attention to SARS-CoV-2 that we're picking up on some of these nuances that we just haven't because it's not been studied as intensively. These may be some general features of, it wouldn't just benefit SARS-CoV-2 to promote increased social interactions if that is what happens. We might expect to see some similar things in other viral infections. And they're, the sexually transmitted diseases, things like herpes viruses, have been one area that's been looked at. Yeah, if others have any thoughts along those lines, you raise an interesting point that this would have had to have evolved probably in some interaction with another host because it's only recently arrived in humans if we think it's an adaptive feature of the virus.
Ronald Willis. Oh.
Thank you. It's another question around what was not in the top 10. And it's, from what I read, men were far more likely to go into the ICUs and men were dying at a faster rate, obviously deep evolutionary reasons. But it never seemed to get a mention in the media. I never saw anything about, consider prioritizing vaccines. What's the story? Have I got it all wrong?
I mean, from a medical perspective, and others can jump in, you were right. Men seem to suffer a greater burden of disease, higher morbidity. They're more likely to be hospitalized than women in general. And from what I understand, of course, there's also a huge impact. We mentioned that there are racial disparities. Another disparity has to do with the age of the infected victim. But my understanding is that women are, the effect of being a woman as opposed to being a man is the effect of being about 10 years younger with regard to being hospitalized or in intensive care or even dying. And maybe a little bit less than that, maybe 8 years, but it's a substantial impact.
Eric Shattuck, you have your hand up for a question.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Hi, Joe. Hi, Molly. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I was just going to offer, I suppose, some comments on the inhibition of sickness behavior that Joe had mentioned. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating, Joe. And I wonder if you've had a chance to look at whether, and you mentioned this in your answer to Molly a little bit, whether the original SARS virus had, many of the same sort of potential properties for inhibiting sickness behavior. And to Molly's point about, whether this has arisen just with humans or if this is something that's, come from another host. Yeah, I mean, I think these sort of pathways that we see, whether it's interferon or interleukins or what have you, these sort of cytokine pathways that really do seem to drive sickness behavior tend to be pretty, I don't want to say universal, but pretty widespread in, a variety of different mammal species. We even see sickness behaviors, if you want to call it that, in fish and insects. So in some ways, it's kind of surprising that we don't see more viruses, adapting to get around sickness behavior. And then actually to just respond to Ronald's thing real quick, why we see more men in the hospital and everything like that. I wonder too, if that's related to gender roles, going back to Martie's points, that men are expected or expect themselves to be more stoic in the face of illness and things like that. And so, put off going to the hospital until it's really just, borderline too late.
And so we've been doing a little bit of research on this in my lab, looking at masculinity and the effects of masculinity on adherence to COVID safety protocols. And as you might expect, the two masculinity is related to not wearing a mask and other protective behaviors. But one thing we're trying to sort out is that masculinity can sort of manifest itself as dominant or as the way we're thinking about it is valiant. And so it could just be that I'm not going to do this because I, am a big, strong guy and I don't need to do these safety things. I'm not scared. Right. And then the other alternative is that I'm the one who needs to take care of the home. I'm the one who needs to go out and get the resources. So I'm going to take the hit. And so we're currently doing some research to try and sort out those alternatives. But we're finding some evidence consistent with both pathways being important.
Richard Katz had a question in the box a while ago. Richard, would you like to ask your question? If Richard's not there, how about Alan Kugel?
Okay, it's Richard. I figured out how to unmute myself.
Okay.
Okay. My question's this. It's about kind of social behaviors writ large. We are not only a social, but an interspecies social species. We're not only us. We're us with our dogs. We're us with our cats. We're us with a variety of the natural world. Now, if you think about it, as a historic precedent, looking at rinderpest as an example, it's a cattle disease that led to human measles about the time that we developed cities. It may have also led to canine distemper. The dogs were with us at the time. I'm curious, now that we've all gone and adopted dogs and cats and who knows what else, and they're with us as a larger and larger part of our lives, as a social replacement perhaps, are we not perhaps, particularly given that these animals can get coronavirus, are we not then possibly facilitating cross-species transmission?
This sounds like a question for Barbara.
See, am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm going to take that question. I'm going to pivot to a related, but slightly, the shape of the question will be a little bit, the comment will be a little different. I think that COVID presents, a challenge and a real opportunity for evolutionary medicine to show what it can do best, which is to think about, answer broad questions about why, and then take those concepts and then return them back to reductive science. And the impact of environmental organisms on our behavior, and I'm going to focus on our development, particularly neurodevelopment, I think is really an open question. And I think that COVID allows us to look at that question in a way that has real salience for what's going on with young people today. So I'm actually asking Charlie in a second to post a paper that really influenced me several years ago. And it was Daniel Ernie. It was a Nature Neuroscience paper, which looked at the role of the enteric microbiome on neurodevelopment, specifically on microglial cells, which are, synaptic pruning cells and, myelinization cells, which are in fact of immune origin. Essentially, the enteric microbiome is helping to shape who we are. And of course, the enteric microbiome is being influenced by environment and association with conspecifics, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that COVID right now, for the way I see the role of thinking about viruses, about not just pathogens, but just the entire microbial universe in which human beings are developing, young human beings are emerging into the adults that they're going to be. I think we can, I think it's a big question about how the viruses themselves, how quarantine, which is going to shape or change for better, for worse, or just in any way at all, who we become. So I have been thinking about this this paper, this Nature Neuroscience paper, and then work that Dan did along with Bob Wayne and Tiffany Armento, looking at how animals before they disperse are changing, how the phenotypes are changing, gene expression is changing, and in fact their microbiomes are changing based on all kinds of things, what they're eating, who they're with, and how that will also affect who they are. So anyway, the point is that as we look at the role of the microbial world and how it's been impacted by COVID itself, by this global changes in behavior, I think we can there'll be some interesting questions to ask moving forward about how it's changed who we are as adults and how neurodevelopment particularly has changed.
I think that's a perfect segue to Nikki Bennett's question. Nikki, would you like to ask your question? And Barb, you might have some further follow-up comments on that, as might other people. Nikki, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I was just, I've been talking about this in one of my EvMed grad courses, and I'm just kind of curious about like the epigenetic effects that could be happening, as well as like the maternal cues that could be going on in utero, et cetera, like children who get sick. If there is a possibility of like tracking how this may affect other developmental aspects of children, whether it's neurological or other sorts of important bodily processes in general, or is it difficult to even monitor this stuff due to confounding factors such as children aren't in school right now, so their learning's taking a hit that way?
I just quickly will thank you. I mean, I do think, of course, we know that prenatal exposure to some viruses, for a long time, people have been looking at what the connections are between those exposures and, you know, neurodevelopmental diseases later in life, including schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorders, et cetera. So again, probably mediated in part by this enteric microbiome microglial association. There are effects of viral exposures on neurodevelopment, particularly, you know, maternal, prenatal, gestational viral exposures during developmentally, you know, relevant windows. I think it's going to be complicated to sort of sort out and tease out confounding factors, but there definitely, I think, will be an important and measurable, ultimately measurable series of questions that we can ask about the impact of COVID exposure, and not just on mothers who themselves contracted COVID during gestation, although that will be, of course, important to look at, but also at how microbial communities have been shifted again by changes in social behavior, and how that might impact the occurrence of virally linked neurodevelopmental disorders in you know, young people, and just neurodevelopment in general.
Terrence Taylor, Terry, you've got a question. Would you like to unmute and ask it?
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for this really interesting discussion. The point that really interested me, looking back over the history of pandemics, when perhaps looking back to a time, 1918 influenza pandemic, and before, the devastating pandemics that repeatedly went across in many parts of the world, the fear of the disease itself seemed to be predominant. I'm making a rather sweeping, you know, not a deep analysis, but right up until the 1918 pandemic, and as the threat of the impact of, in fact, the rate of mortality from infectious disease was dominant really up until the mid 1940s. After that time, now we're into, you know, the impact on social behavior being rather different. I mean, if we were to look at now, and I think we have to be careful about having a first world discussion here, it's about resistance to the measure, resistance to the countermeasures, wearing masks and these sorts of things. I wonder if you, I wonder if you could just reflect, looking at the work you've done in your paper, how there's a big difference in the social impact of a pandemic, which is having a very high mortality rate, higher mortality rate in places like South Asia and so on. I wonder if you think about that, or we're seeming to focus on, you know, the impact on social life rather than the fear of the disease itself. I may put it rather crudely. I wonder if you'd comment.
My comment is that those are just wonderful points. And I think that it's just there's ripe areas both for further study, and just to kind of echo what Marty said earlier, that this is going to provide fertile ground for, you know, so many research careers going into the future. And I'm struck by the fact that in some ways this pandemic seems so different, as you said, but what's happening in India is so radically different from what's happening where I am right now. And I happen to be on the big island of Hawaii, where things are relatively under control for a variety of reasons, including the fact that every tourist gets screened before arriving here. So there's huge geographic and social variation in this disease, but in many ways, I think it's actually quite similar to the experience of 1918 in reading about that experience, that overall kind of zooming out, we see the same kinds of suite of human responses and social responses and resistance to mask wearing and that was seen in that previous pandemic.
Anishka Bandara has a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, so I know like the main focus of these EvMed events is evolutionary medicine. And currently I'm in Dr. Horowitz's class on evolutionary medicine, and we've been looking at links between animal susceptibility to certain diseases and human susceptibility to those same conditions. And I thought it was really interesting that we brought up the point that the enteric microbiome affects neurodevelopment, specifically with like glial cells. And I was wondering if there are maybe examples of other species where viral exposure or changes in behavior due to viral exposure have affected that sort of link.
I guess I should jump in and say hi, Anishka. Thanks for joining us. Great to see some of the students here. Well, I mean, off the top of my head, I'm not gonna be able to cite specific studies, but certainly, and I think some of the people today, the speakers have mentioned it in the chat, the many examples of viruses that do change behavior, of course, in their hosts, and underlying behavioral changes, some neurophysiology. So as we become more reductive, so we look at the phenomenon, right, and we ask questions about it, and as we become more reductive, we kind of look at how that is happening. Ultimately, we're going to be looking at a process, at a reductive process. So I think it's extremely likely, and there may be others who can quickly come up with some examples, but just from our class, we know of a number of mammalian examples, avian examples, and of course, invertebrate examples of viruses that profoundly alter host behavior.
Paolo Danovsky, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Just coming back to the point about risk being greater among men, it's basically twice the risk of dying in men. And I'm asking whether this increase in risk is mostly mediated by risky behavior, or you think that not all of it, or not even most of it?
If I could just jump in and say, I think, and I'm sure everybody on the call would agree, we need to be very cautious in kind of trying to come up with explanations for these differences in cause of death across males and females. We're talking about an extremely complex, undoubtedly multifactorial phenomenon. We're looking at everything from social determinants of health and the profound impact of many of those. But we're also looking potentially at what I think may be a really under-examined difference in major organ systems in male and female mammals, just have to do with the need for females to accommodate the hemodynamic challenges of pregnancy and all the immunological challenges, et cetera, and that as we look at vulnerability to females versus males, that some of it may simply represent epiphenomenon related to these fundamental differences in mammalian male and female physiology, in placental mammalian male and female physiologies. So I think we just need to be careful when we get down to, I see some folks talking about some sort of explanations. It's complicated, and I think there are evolutionary answers, macro evolutionary answers that we get to consider.
Questions are coming in pretty quickly. Dinah Sherry, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hello. My question from the chat is, would anyone care to comment from the evolutionary perspective on the policy of mass vaccination during a pandemic? In other words, the selective pressure that creates and mutations we know are inevitable. Thank you.
Great question. I think one of the concerns might be that anything that has the potential to impact, say, fitness of an organism like a virus in a dramatic way, like a vaccine, is going to exert a pretty massive selective pressure and will also benefit any potential variants that are able to succeed in vaccine escape. So that's something that we need to look for. As far as I understand, at least for the mRNA vaccines, we don't see evidence of that vaccine escape thus far, at least to any significant degree, which is reassuring. But I think that you raise an interesting point, and it's something we need to be alert to.
Vahdin Orishvekcic, I'm sorry for butchering your name, has a question. Would you like to ask your question? You're on mute.
I pressed the wrong icon. I'm actually an MD, MPH, and I have a question about agency in medical schools, right? So we spend over about $1.1 trillion on hospitals in this country. And we have an incredible biomedical machine in terms of testing. And if you look at testing, Harvard and MIT joined together to do testing on private college campuses, 108 private college campuses. And that they did more testing at one point in time, because this is obviously a moving number, than 25 states. Now, if you look at their college campuses and you look at private colleges in New England, that's an amazing diversion of testing from people of all of the diversity of this country to an elite white upper middle class population. The University of Illinois did the same thing. And if you added the number of tests that these two entities did, they did more than 32 states. Now, if you look at the outbreak of coronavirus in Massachusetts, it's one of the 2 or 3 worst states in the country. If you look at North Carolina has not met WHO criteria for testing for months. And if you look at Duke was a bubble where every student is tested. I run a program, and there's a kid graduating from Duke this year. I have a student at MIT, and she was tested twice a week. And the test positivity at MIT, at Harvard, and all these 108 colleges, and the University of Illinois was like under 1% throughout the whole epidemic. Whereas, North Carolina has been running 5, 6, 7%. This is kind of, in my boomer mentality, an amazing amount of structural racism and diversion of testing for the benefit of elite people. And this is a blue zone in North Carolina testing itself and not taking care of the rest of North Carolina. The only medical school that seemed to have addressed this issue is the University of California at Davis. And I would like to have commentary on this.
Anyone should feel free to comment if they have a position or panelists.
For me, it's hard to evaluate those numbers without knowing what the flow of tests that, without knowing more about the background of, how many tests were available, what, were they really being diverted? So that raises so many more questions.
There is absolutely no doubt. There's absolutely no doubt, because if you look, even University of Illinois documented this diversion.
Yeah.
And, there are students,
I understand the point.
There was even an article in the New England Journal of Medicine.
That's the way it's, that seems to be, there seems like we need a lot of information in order to evaluate.
Well, it is a difficulty. I agree with you.
And when I saw those bubbles, my first thought was not that it was about the elites, but rather that there was showing some leadership of getting the virus under control. So I think that
on their own campus, on their own white, affluent campuses, right? So that Duke could play basketball, right? I mean, Yale University Medical School, probably made millions of dollars serving the NBA, right? I mean, there were basketball players that got tested.
I'm going to move on to a
every day.
couple other questions. These are
I think
very
we don't have
valid.
enough information.
I think they're really valid
And
points.
Dan, can I add one thing? And of course, that is an extremely important point. I just want to add a little bit of positivity, because there are some really deep and important, and I think very generative conversations that are happening in medical school admissions committees about who's being admitted. And if you talk to medical students, and I talk to a lot of medical students a lot at different medical schools, for the most part, they are deeply committed. The future leaders in medicine, future physicians, are deeply committed to equity. To this generation is, I'm optimistic about the potential for real transformation and better decision making in the future.
Actually, I have
there was
to say
actually
that
an article in the New England Journal of Medicine documenting the fact that Black males are less likely to enter medical school now than they did in past decades.
And I was going to say, I'm not optimistic at all, because I mean, we've seen these promises before, and what we really need to see is a change in the actual data, which is why, again, not going back to my first point, but I was so disappointed that the analysis of this paper did not include a discussion of this, because it was one of the most clear and apparent aspects of the COVID pandemic in the United States and the UK.
So David Felici has a question that is explicitly about ecology and evolution and communication and human behavior. David, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, so I was just interested in if anyone had the opinion that there were aspects or perspectives from this paper that aren't clearly being communicated by public health experts, and if so, what major perspectives should be brought into the public perspective in controlling this pandemic?
Panelists?
I mean, I think that many of our 10 perspectives are at a fairly early stage, and at least speaking for the one that Athena and I wrote, may not be actionable beyond what is kind of clear and straightforward public health advice. But these are areas that I think are worthy of point towards more research that could be actionable and may have a big impact on how we deal with future pandemics.
And I just,
this one.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
just quickly, I would say in general, an identified knowledge exchange gap exists between the health of wildlife and human health. Some of those connections, I'm not talking about necessarily, COVID infection in wildlife and as a one-to-one, but just the epiphenomena associated with the pandemic, that there is a knowledge exchange gap that I think the human public health community, the global public health community, can benefit from paying greater attention to what is happening to wildlife, to the development and health of wildlife.
Mandy Azar has a question. Mandy, would you like to ask your question?
Hi. I actually, was just a comment that I thought that we should be mindful of the newer aspect of the effect of the internet and how we communicate. That's different. That happened, from like 10 years ago. That how we spread information, whether it's factual or actually, not falsehoods. For example, I know that because everybody there were articles that came up touting the effect of zinc, using zinc. And so now there are increasing levels of potential zinc toxicity because people are taking high doses of zinc in order to prevent COVID. So, or, vaccine hesitancy, or so the effect of how the internet is playing into this virus transmission. That's the only comment I was making. No real question.
Anyone
I think that's a really, I'll comment if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think that's an excellent point, Mandy. And this actually gets to, and earlier in the chat, someone mentioned Carl Bergstrom's criticism of this paper. And I maybe think about that. I meant to look it up before this call, but I haven't looked at that for months. and it also maybe gets to Joe Graves' mention of just so stories in kind of raising the initial discussion of this paper. And the point I want to make here is that there's been an amazing amount of bad science around SARS-CoV-2. Zinc, hydroxychloroquine, I would say the majority of the clinical studies that have been published are garbage. And I just make that point to say that this is a call for both good research and especially good clinical research and good public health research. And I think that I believe, and this has been the motivating factor of my career, that taking an evolutionary perspective can actually improve the quality of the science. And I want to push back against the idea that just taking an adaptationist perspective or raising a hypothesis with the obvious caveats that come along with that, that's somehow bad science. I want to make a plug here that just to defend this perspective of bringing in an adaptationist point of view to this discussion, I think is very valuable.
I just actually want to add to that. Hi, Mandy, good to see you. That behavioral ecologists, such as Dan Blumstein, for example, have long pointed to the potential for exploitation using fear. Animals, predatory animals use fear to exploit animals to eat them, and conspecifics use exploit the fear of others to gain benefit. So this potential for exploitation is certainly amplified by the internet, for sure. But back to you, Dan. Would you comment on fear and exploitation?
Yeah, I mean, fear can be, weaponized, and we should be aware that, we can be susceptible to that. But I'm not here to talk. I'm here to ask questions or facilitate questions. Nick Thompson Gonzalez, and then Mark Nichter, and then I guess we'll be done. Nick, you have a question?
Yep, I do. Thank you so much, Dan. So thank you all so much for making yourselves available to discuss this paper that you wrote. I was really curious, in the paper, there's a certain tension, I think, between Insight 3 and Insight 6, I think, and it has to do with this idea that, we can co-opt disgust, kind of what you guys were just talking about in terms of fear. We can co-opt disgust for good reasons, but then it's kind of a double-edged sword with making things pretty exclusionary and creating an outgroup, which are the sick. And so I guess to keep this in an evolutionary framework, I'm kind of searching for any evolutionarily relevant examples of protection and inclusion in terms of protection, in terms of avoidance and disgust, but at the same time maintaining a priority of the unit, the integrity of a unit. And if not, then perhaps you guys could just maybe speak to some thoughts about what kind of policy messaging or cultural messaging we could employ to not lean too much to one side or the other.
So the point, Insight 3 was about activating disgust, and possibly that would get people to engage in more self-protection and prevent transmission of the disease. One of the things that's been surprising to me is how little that hypothesis has been supported. If people feel personally vulnerable to disease, so the disgust researchers who've been exploring this, the main finding is that if you feel personally vulnerable, then you engage in more protective behaviors. That's not, so just eliciting disgust is not enough. It doesn't seem to have a market effect on people's avoidance, engaging in these avoidance behaviors. So I don't think we need to worry too much about a massive campaign of using disgust in order to combat the disease, because that doesn't seem to be the thing that is eliciting protective behavior, self-protective behavior.
Can I just
go ahead?
Thanks, Dan. Sorry, just wanted to jump in. So I actually have a little bit of data from a survey showing that if you take the PVID scale, perceived vulnerability to infectious disease scale. It's got the 2 subscales, germ aversion, and then the other one, which name escapes me right now. But in this survey, here on our campus at least, germ aversion, the higher your germ aversion score, the less COVID knowledge you had. And this was early on in the pandemic, about mid-March 2020, about 3 weeks after the first case in Texas. So I think that's really interesting, and I think points a way that we can use some aspects of discuss, not discussed as a global feature, but this aspect of germ aversion to improve our public health messaging, to say, hey, you don't have to be scared of it, it's okay. And hopefully that comes along with some increase in knowledge retention or attention to public health messaging. We don't have the data to get at what exactly is going on there with that knowledge score, but yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're going to keep this to an hour. I want to thank our speakers, Marty and Joe and Barb, who came in heroically at the last second when Athena couldn't join us. And I'd like to thank all of you for asking questions. And I hope you enjoyed this discussion. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Charlie, what's happening next week?
Okay, yeah, let me just echo Dan's gratitude. This was a great discussion. We covered a lot of ground. I know we could keep going. I didn't even get to ask my question yet, but I know how to get in touch with the author, so I can ask that later. Let me share with you what's coming up, at least for our next speaker, if I can share my screen here. Hopefully you're seeing our Club EvMed website and the great conversation we had today. And our next one will be May 17th. So that's next week, Monday at 12, same time. Divergent evolutionary roots for post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. We're going to be hearing from Sarah Matthew from ASU and Matthew Zefferman from the Naval Postgraduate School. It should be a really good discussion and conversation. And I'll say that we haven't put it up on the Club EvMed yet, but we have about 6 or 7 people lined up for the summer. We'll try to maintain about every 2-week seminar series throughout the summer. Some of you are on this call. Thanks for joining today. And with that, I'm going to thank everyone again for a really great conversation and for sharing your perspectives. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Marty,
Thanks for the invitation.
Joe, who's on vacation, doing a Club EvMed, Barb and Dan. Thanks, everybody.